My father told me my whole life that women don't understand business. When he died, he left everything to my brother. 3 years later, I wish he could see what I built. I'm writing this from my office on the 14th floor of a building I own. Not renting. Not leasing a suite in. The view faces west, and on clear evenings the sun hits the glass towers across the street and turns them the color of old copper, and I sit here sometimes after my assistant leaves and I think about my father, and I feel something I've never been able to name correctly. It isn't grief exactly. It isn't satisfaction. It's closer to the feeling you get when you finally understand the last line of a poem you've been reading your whole life. My name is Claire. I'm 38 years old. I have an MBA from Wharton, 12 years of experience in commercial real estate acquisitions, and a portfolio currently valued at just under $47 million. I built the last $31 million of that in 3 years. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. This story isn't about hating my father. I loved my father. The problem is that he never quite figured out how to love me back in a way I could use. Background, because context matters. My father, Robert, was a self-made man in the truest and most exhausting sense of the phrase. He grew up with nothing in a mid-sized Ohio city, the son of a plumber, and by 30 he had purchased his first duplex with money saved from 10 years of working construction. By 40 he owned 11 residential properties. By 60 he had a portfolio of 22 properties, a mix of residential rentals, 2 small commercial strips, and a warehouse outside the city he leased to a logistics company. It was worth approximately $16 million when he died at 67 from a heart attack that his cardiologist had been predicting for 4 years. My brother Daniel is 41. He works, or worked, in sales. Medical device sales, specifically, which is a perfectly respectable career and one that had absolutely nothing to do with real estate, property management, asset valuation, lease negotiation, zoning law, or anything adjacent to those fields. Daniel is charming and funny and has always been my father's favorite in the way that some sons are their father's favorites, which is to say, automatically, without requiring demonstration. I, on the other hand, have been trying to demonstrate my entire life. I remember sitting at my father's kitchen table when I was 19, home from my first year of college, telling him I wanted to study finance. He looked at me across his coffee cup. I can still see the exact mug. It said "World's Okayest Fisherman" on it, and he said, not unkindly, "Claire, women are great at a lot of things. Business is more of a feel thing. It's instinct. I just don't think that's how women are built." He said it the way you'd tell someone they probably wouldn't enjoy spicy food. Observational. Casual. Like he was doing me a favor by being honest. I got my MBA anyway. I went into commercial real estate anyway. I spent 12 years becoming genuinely excellent at my job anyway. And every time I came home, my father would ask Daniel questions about his sales numbers and ask me questions about whether I was seeing anyone. I want to be precise here because I think precision matters. My father was not a cruel man. He was not malicious. He was a man who had built his entire worldview in an era and a culture that handed him certain assumptions about the natural order of things, and he had never been sufficiently challenged to examine them. He loved me. He just didn't respect me. And for most of my adult life, I confused those two things or pretended they were the same. The will. He had a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March, which is, in my experience, exactly the kind of thing that happens on a Tuesday morning in March. My brother called me. I drove 4 hours. By the time I arrived at the hospital, our father had already been gone for 2 hours and Daniel was in the waiting room looking pale and genuinely broken, because whatever else you can say about their relationship, it was real. I held my brother in that waiting room and I cried with him, and I meant every tear. The will reading was 3 weeks later, handled by my father's attorney, a man named Gerald who had been doing my father's legal work for over 2 decades and who had the particular quality of certain older male attorneys of seeming mildly surprised whenever a woman asked a direct question. The will was straightforward. The residential property portfolio, all 22 properties, went to Daniel. The logistics warehouse lease, valued separately, went to Daniel. The liquid assets, roughly $200,000 after debts and expenses, were to be split equally between Daniel and me. There was a paragraph in the will that Gerald read in a slightly quieter voice, which I have since committed to memory. I leave the management of my real estate holdings to my son Daniel, as I believe he has the temperament and instincts required for this kind of business. I have provided for my daughter Claire in other ways throughout her life, and I am confident she will continue to find her footing in her own pursuits. I sat in Gerald's conference room for approximately 30 seconds after Gerald finished reading. Then I said, "I'd like a copy of that document, please." Gerald looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the table. I looked at Gerald until he looked back at me. "Of course," he said. "What I did that night. I drove to a hotel instead of staying at the family home, which felt correct. I ordered room service. I didn't eat. I opened my laptop and I spent 4 hours reading Ohio probate law, and then I called my friend Renata, who is a probate and estates attorney in Columbus, and who has the rare quality of answering her phone at 11 o'clock at night when her friend's call sounding the way I must have sounded. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her everything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Claire, he cut you out of $16 million in assets because he thought women don't understand business." "Yes." "And you have an MBA from Wharton and 12 years in commercial real estate." "Yes." "And Daniel is in medical device sales." "Correct." Another pause. "Okay," she said. "Here's what we're going to do. The legal situation. I want to be honest with you about this part, because I've seen versions of this story online where the legal challenge is presented as a slam dunk, and it wasn't. Will contests are difficult. They succeed when you can demonstrate specific legal grounds, undue influence, lack of testamentary capacity, fraud, or procedural defects in the execution of the document itself. What we had was subtler, and Renata was careful with me about it from the beginning. What we had was a combination of factors. My father had updated this will 14 months before his death, during a period when his health had begun to decline and when Daniel had moved back to the area and was spending significant time with him. Gerald's notes from the will update showed 3 meetings with my father in which Daniel was also present, which is unusual. Typically, an attorney meeting with a client to update their estate documents would meet with that client alone. We also had 2 witnesses, a neighbor and a former colleague of my father's, who were willing to attest that in the last 18 months of his life, my father had made statements suggesting Daniel was guiding him on decisions. One of them recalled a specific conversation in which my father mentioned that Daniel had explained the tax advantages of structuring the will a certain way. Renata was direct with me. "We're not going to win on undue influence conclusively," she said. "What we might win, or more likely settle, is by demonstrating enough procedural irregularity and raising enough questions about the circumstances of the update that contesting becomes expensive and uncertain enough for Daniel that a settlement makes sense." "What kind of settlement?" "Best case. 50-50 on the portfolio." I thought about this. Half of 16 million was 8 million. 8 million in real estate assets, not liquid, but real, manageable, leverageable, was something I could work with in a way that Daniel, I was fairly certain, could not. "Do it," I said. "The filing. I want to say something about Daniel here, because I don't want you to read this as a story about a villain. Daniel didn't steal from me. He didn't forge a document or threaten our father. What he did was probably more passive than that. He was around, he was present, he was charming in the way he's always been charming, and our father looked at him and saw his own reflection and made decisions accordingly. Daniel probably told himself, as people do, that he'd take care of me. That he'd be fair. That it was what Dad wanted. When Renata filed the contest, Daniel called me. "Claire," he said. "Come on." "I know," I said. "Dad wanted." "Daniel." I kept my voice even. I had practiced keeping my voice even. "I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm telling you that I have retained counsel and we're proceeding. If you want to resolve this quickly, that option is available." He didn't respond for a moment. Then he said, "I can't believe you're doing this." "I know," I said again, because I did know, and because I also knew that his disbelief was genuine and that it came from the same place my father's assumptions came from, the unchallenged certainty that I would, as I always had, find my footing in my own pursuits. The legal process took 9 months. I will spare you the procedural details. There were depositions, and there were document requests, and there was a mediation session in August that lasted 11 hours and produced nothing. There were moments when Renata looked at me carefully across conference room tables, and I could tell she was assessing whether I had the stamina for it. I had the stamina for it. Update 1. The settlement. In November, 8 months after my father's death, we reached a settlement. The portfolio was split 50-50. I received 11 properties, 8 residential rentals, 1 commercial strip with 4 tenants, and a mixed-use building on the north side of the city that had a ground-floor retail space and 4 apartments above it. Daniel received the remaining 11 properties, including the warehouse lease, which was the single most stable income-producing asset in the portfolio. The total value of my half at the time of settlement was assessed at approximately $7.8 million. I remember the day I signed those documents with a clarity I reserve for very few moments in my life. Renata walked me out to the parking lot afterward and we stood in the November cold and she said, "What are you going to do now?" "Work," I said. She laughed. "Claire, maybe take a week." "I've been taking a week for 38 years, I said. "I'm done taking weeks." What Daniel did with his half. I'll make this brief because it's not the center of the story, though I'd be dishonest if I said it wasn't part of it. Daniel sold his entire share of the portfolio within the first 6 weeks of settlement. All 11 properties, sold to a local investment group at a price that his attorney apparently negotiated without consulting anyone with actual real estate expertise. I heard the number through the industry. My world is smaller than people think, and it was below market. Meaningfully below market. The warehouse lease alone was undervalued by what I estimated at the time to be around $400,000. He took the cash and, as I understand it, paid off his house and invested the remainder with a financial advisor. That's not a foolish thing to do with a cash windfall. But it was a $7 million portfolio he converted to what I would estimate was around $6 million in liquid assets, because he didn't know what he was looking at and he moved quickly because he wanted it done. My father left him everything because he believed Daniel had the instincts for this business. I thought about that for exactly as long as it took me to have one glass of wine the night I heard the news, and then I got back to work. Update 2. The first year. The first thing I did was hire a property manager, which sounds counterintuitive if you're imagining I was trying to prove something by doing everything myself. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was trying to build something. A good operator delegates what can be delegated and focuses energy where expertise creates the most value. My expertise was in acquisition and development, not in fielding calls about broken furnaces. The second thing I did was have every property in my portfolio independently assessed. This is basic. This is the first thing any serious investor does with an inherited portfolio. You don't assume the previous owner's valuation is accurate or that they were optimizing for growth rather than comfort. What the assessments revealed was instructive. My father had been a good landlord in the sense that his properties were well maintained and his tenants generally stayed. He was not a sophisticated investor in the sense that he had not raised rents to market rate in several cases, had not explored rezoning options on several properties that sat on land with significantly higher use potential, and had been carrying one commercial tenant on the strip at a below-market rent for over a decade because the tenant was, as nearly as I could determine from the lease files, a friend. Within the first 6 months, I had renegotiated 2 commercial leases to market rate, begun the rezoning application process on a residential property that sat on a corner lot in an area the city was actively developing, and replaced one residential property manager who, I discovered during my audit, had been skimming small amounts from maintenance accounts for at least 2 years. I was not emotional about any of this. These were business decisions. The friend tenant on the commercial strip I met with personally. I told him directly that his lease was expiring and I needed to move to market rate. He was unhappy. I understood that. I also raised his rent by 22% and he signed the new lease. By the end of year 1, my portfolio's net operating income had increased by 31%. I had not yet made a single acquisition. I had simply operated what I had, correctly. Update 3. The acquisition. The corner lot rezoning was approved in the spring of my second year, 14 months after settlement. The property was a modest 4-unit residential building that I had acquired at a residential valuation. Once it was zoned mixed-use commercial, its value approximately doubled on paper. I refinanced it at the new valuation, which freed up just under $1 million in equity, and I used that to fund the down payment on my first acquisition. I want to pause here and say something about leverage, because I think people who haven't worked in real estate don't fully understand how the asset class functions. Real estate is one of the few investment vehicles where a bank will routinely loan you a significant multiple of your equity to control a much larger asset, and where the asset itself, if selected correctly, generates the cash flow to service that debt. This is not magic. It is not complicated. It is the mechanical reality of the business, and it is why my father was able to turn a construction worker's savings into a $16 million portfolio over 30 years. I simply intended to do in 3 years what had taken him 30, because I was starting from a different position and because I understood the instrument I was playing. The first acquisition was a 12-unit residential building 2 miles from downtown, purchased from an estate sale at a price that reflected the heir's desire for a fast close rather than the property's actual value. I knew the building. I had actually walked it years earlier when I was evaluating deals professionally. I knew its bones were good and its management had been poor, and that with a competent operator and modest capital improvements, its rents could be raised substantially. I closed in 31 days. 6 months later, after improvements and re-tenanting, its operating income had increased by 40% and its appraised value had increased by approximately $1.4 million over purchase price. This is what my father thought I didn't have the instincts for. I made 3 acquisitions in my second year. Each of them followed the same logic. Find an asset whose price reflects circumstances rather than fundamentals, acquire it efficiently, improve the operation, realize the value. It is not a novel strategy. It is the oldest strategy in real estate. It works when you execute it with discipline and when you know how to read a property. I know how to read a property. Update 4. The moment I didn't expect. About 2 years after the settlement, I had lunch with my cousin Petra, who is the family's institutional memory in the way that certain people become. She's the one who shows up at every gathering and remembers everything and connects everyone and keeps the whole structure from collapsing into estrangement. Petra told me, over salads I barely touched, that Daniel was struggling. His cash investment had not performed the way he'd hoped. Some of it was in a fund that had a rough year, some of it he'd spent, and the psychological weight of having had something and dispensed with it quickly had not, apparently, been easy to carry. He had, she said carefully, mentioned to her that he wondered if he'd made the right call. I sat with this for a moment. Then I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." Petra gave me a look that meant she knew I meant it and that she also knew the situation was complicated. "He never thought you'd build it the way you did," she said. "None of us did." "I know. Your father," she started and then stopped. "I know," I said again. "I want to tell you that I felt triumph in that moment. It would make for a more satisfying story. What I actually felt was tired, and something older and more complicated than triumph, which was the feeling of having been right about something for so long that being proved right no longer felt like the point. What I had wanted, my whole life, was not to be vindicated. I had wanted my father to see me. And he was gone, and he had never quite managed it, and that wasn't a problem I could solve by tripling a portfolio, however satisfying it was to triple the portfolio. I paid for lunch. Petra hugged me in the parking lot. I drove back to my office, not my current one, a smaller one then, and I sat at my desk for a long time, and I thought about my father building his first duplex with his hands, and I thought about the fact that we were not as different as he had believed, and that he had gone to his grave not knowing that. Update 5, the third year. By the end of year 3, I had 14 properties. The portfolio's assessed value was $46.8 million. I had grown it by roughly $31 million from the $7.8 million I had received in settlement. I had done this through a combination of the methods I described: smart operations, equity recycling through refinancing, targeted acquisitions from motivated sellers, and one larger move in my third year that I'll describe briefly. I partnered with a small development group to convert a former light industrial property I had acquired into a mixed-use residential and retail building. It was the most complex thing I had done, and it carried real risk, and it took 11 months and several points where I was not entirely certain I had not overextended. It completed in October of last year, and it added approximately $12 million in value to the portfolio. I moved into my current office in November. The first week I was there, Daniel called me. We hadn't spoken much in the preceding 2 years. Not from anger, I want to be clear about that, but from the particular kind of distance that settles between people who went through something difficult together and came out of it differently. He called on a Tuesday evening when I was still at the office, and I saw his name on my phone and I sat with it for a moment before I answered. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. A pause that was not uncomfortable exactly but was full of everything we hadn't said. Then, "I heard about the industrial conversion project. Word travels." "It does," I said. "Claire," he said. He stopped. Started again. "I want you to know that I don't resent you. For the contest. I think I was angry for a while, but I've been thinking about it and I was wrong to be angry. He should have, another stop." I waited. "He should have written it differently," Daniel said. "It wasn't fair." I looked out the window at the copper-colored buildings going dark in the autumn evening. "No," I said. "It wasn't." "I think he would have been proud of you," Daniel said, and his voice was rough in the way our voices get when we mean the thing we're saying and we're not used to saying it. "I think if he could see." "Daniel," I said gently, "you don't have to do this." "I want to," he said. So I let him. I listened. And when he was done I told him I was glad he called, and I meant that too. Where things stand. I'm sitting in my office on the 14th floor of a building I own, writing this out because someone asked me to, and because I think there are pieces of this story that I've needed to put somewhere outside of my own head. My father was not the villain of this story. I want to say that clearly, not because I need to protect his memory but because it's true. The villain, if there is one, is a set of ideas he absorbed so thoroughly he never questioned them. The idea that there are people who naturally understand certain things and people who naturally don't, and that you can sort them by categories. That instinct is inherited, not built. That who you are at birth determines the shape of what you can become. My father worked his whole life to disprove that idea about himself, the plumber's son who couldn't possibly understand how business works. And in disproving it, he built something real. He just couldn't extend that same logic to his daughter. That's not a simple failure. It's a kind of tragedy, actually, and I've sat with it long enough to call it that without flinching. What I did was not remarkable. I want to say that too. I am good at my job. I worked hard. I made mostly correct decisions, and I made a few incorrect ones I corrected quickly, and I had a foundational asset base that the settlement gave me. A different person with the same skills might have built more. A different person with the same assets might have built less. What I am is the person who did the work, consistently, because I was not going to be the story my father had already written for me. The practical notes, for anyone who needs them. If you inherit property and you don't know what you have, get independent assessments from multiple appraisers before you make any decisions. Do not assume the previous owner's management was optimal. Do not sell quickly unless you genuinely need liquidity, because real estate is an asset class that punishes speed and rewards patience. And if you think you are owed a more careful examination of an estate document, find a probate attorney and ask them directly what your options are. I am not a lawyer. I am not giving legal advice. I am just a woman who hired a good one and paid attention. Final note. I keep a photograph on my desk. It's one of the few things I have from my father's house. It's a picture of him standing in front of the duplex he bought when he was 30, his first property. He's wearing a plaid shirt and he's squinting into the sun, and he looks exactly like the man he was going to become, the man who was just barely visible inside the young man in the picture. I think about him standing there. I think about what he built from that beginning, and I think it was remarkable, actually, and I think he deserved more credit than he probably gave himself. I look at that picture sometimes and I say, out loud, to nobody, "You were wrong about me. But you built the thing I built from. So thank you for that, at least." And then I get back to work.